bienvenidos a las charlas del Ático. Pues soy Fernando, editor de Ático de los Libros, y es un placer estar pues, con un auténtico coloso de la historia narrativa, como es Dan Jones. Estoy seguro de que lo conocéis. Estudió en Cambridge de la mano de David Starkey y bueno, pues luego, como vengo diciendo, maestro absoluto de la historia narrativa. Ha escrito un montón de ensayos que hemos publicado aquí en Ático de los Libros, como Los Cruzados, Los Templarios, Poder y Tronos. Ahora estamos publicando Enrique V, que es un ensayo magnífico sobre este personaje tan singular, el mejor rey inglés de la Edad Media. También se ha adentrado en lo que es la novela histórica con la trilogía de Los Perros de Essex, Lobos de Invierno y Corazones de León, que bueno, pues sigue un poco la historia de unos hermanos de armas en la Guerra de los 100 años, como si fuera un poco el desembarco en Normandía, pero llevado a la Edad Media, una trilogía histórica que desde luego os recomendamos que leáis porque es fantástica. Y bueno, pues es un auténtico coloso, literalmente, mide cerca del 1,90 m, para los que no somos tan altos es bastante impresionante, y también pues ha colaborado pues, con Netflix, documentales, cine, asesoría de todo tipo. Un auténtico monstruo de la historia. Es un placer estar con él hoy. Hi, Dan. Welcome.
Hi, Fernando. Thank you for that kind introduction.
Yeah, you deserve it. You deserve it. So, I mean, for somebody so passionate about history, I think that's the question. Why are you so passionate about history?
Why am I passionate about history? Well, I think that we're quite lucky in studying history in that the subject matter is very broad. It's the broadest of all the subject matters in a way, in that it's the whole sum total of all human deeds and achievements, is everything that's ever happened. So, so if you're a curious person, then I think it's natural to be interested in history, and I'm always have been quite a curious person. So I was also, some of it's luck. When I was young, a long time ago, when I was studying in school, I had several great teachers. I had a great teacher at school who really brought quite old-fashioned history to life. Mm-hmm. We were studying Tudor history and Second World War history. I mean, very sort of standard stuff you learn at school, but he was a really brilliant mentor and teacher to me. And then when I went on to university, I mean, you mentioned David Starkey. David was a great mentor to me, and there were several others, Helen Castor, Christine Carpenter, and others too. And so I was lucky always to study with very interesting, very engaging mentors. And from that, I just never stopped doing history. I thought for a little while that I'd become a lawyer, and I just didn't like the idea of all the paperwork. So I became a historian instead. Yeah, that's probably where the passion comes from.
So, a book about Henry V. First question, who is Henry V? For the Spanish reader, who is that king?
Well, English history produces a lot of kings called Henry, as you know. And Henry VIII, of course, is very famous. But
not as much as Spanish history produces Alfonsos.
That's true, of course. You can always beat us there. But Henry VIII is the most, the best known, the most cartoonish. But what's interesting is Henry VIII himself thought Henry V was the greatest, was the model. If you look at the beginning of Henry VIII's reign, the first thing he does on becoming a king is launch an invasion of France, which is in imitation of Henry V, because in Henry V's lifetime, well, he was born in 1386 and died in 1422, 35 years, a short time. In his lifetime, and for hundreds of years thereafter, he was considered the greatest king that England had ever produced. He fulfilled what was considered to be the absolute sort of perfect model of English kingship, which boiled down to two things. On the one hand, it was being a lawgiver, a provider of justice. On the other hand, it was being a great warrior. The two things were interconnected. You couldn't have war without justice, and war was in itself an expression of justice, certainly to Henry V. So he mastered both of these, it seemed to his contemporaries, and it seemed to many historians as well. And in war in particular, he achieved the great aim of all medieval kings from Edward III onwards, which was to claim the crown of France. Now, he didn't just use that as an excuse for invading France, but he managed invaded France in 1415. 5 years later, under the Treaty of Troyes, 1420, he laid claim in law to the French crown. He became the heir and regent of the crown of France, and his son, Henry VI, eventually would become a king of France, albeit only briefly. So this was the end goal, the stated aim of all English medieval kings, and he was the one who went and did it. And he also did something very clever, which was to die at exactly the right moment. Not very clever, but he died at the age of 35 in 1422, right at the moment of his highest achievement. So unlike his great-grandfather Edward III, he didn't live a fully realised long life in which he outlived his conquests. And so that reputation for having made these great achievements kind of stuck with him at the moment of his death. And so he the sort of James Dean idea, he lived fast, died young, left, if not a beautiful corpse, because he was ravaged by dysentery, he left a great reputation.
Yeah. So it's a king that the period is like 100 Years' War. What was the 100 Years' War? Yeah.
Well, put simply, the 100 Years' War was a contest between England and France for the crown of France. There'd been a succession crisis in the 1320s in France, and among the various claimants to the throne of France had been Edward III, whose mother had been a daughter of King Philip IV of France, and his father was Edward II of England. So there was a claim, albeit not an uncontested claim, but there was a claim by English kings from then on to be the kings of France. The war for that, but that's the sort of central dynastic issue. Around that were all the other aspects of competition between France and England that existed in the Middle Ages. The commercial interest in controlling the Channel, the interest in controlling the affairs of Flanders, which was an economically prosperous region, the interests in Aquitaine, wine producing region, and the connective tissue between France and the Spanish kingdom south of the Pyrenees. Whoever controlled the western seaboard of France effectively was the powerhouse of Western Europe, and it was a contest economically between England and France for that, expressed through demand for the crown. But as the 100 Years' War wasn't known as that at the time, but as we now call it, as this war advanced through the 14th century into the 15th, it dragged in other European powers as well. Scotland, very obviously, the Spanish kingdoms at times, Flanders, the various states that made up what we would today call Germany. I mean, it became, in some senses, a Western European war. It became linked to the contests for the papacy, when you had papal schism for a long time, French popes, Roman popes, Pisan popes at some point. So this is a very complex, interrelated war, which, the greatest modern historian of the 100 Years' War, Jonathan Sumption, has written a 5-volume history of it, which took 43 years to write. Half as long as the war itself, and runs to 5,000 pages. It's a complicated war, but as I say, at the heart of it was this sense, was the issue of who's the king of France. Well, Henry V answered that question.
He became both the king of England or king of France.
He almost did. He died 6 weeks too early, but he was the king of England, and he became the heir and regent of the crown of France, a claim which he passed on to his son, Henry VI,
who eventually became like the king of France.
He was crowned king of France in Paris. It wasn't the same as being crowned in Rouen. It was, but like it's as good as anyone ever got.
Oh, that's a great achievement. So Henry V is one of the great character. Really particular character. But I have to say, in your book, there are so many interesting characters. For example, the arrogant Dauphin. You have, for example, John the Faithless, which is like political monster. He's great at it. And of course, you have Charles VI, which is the king of France, and he's mad.
Yes,
so, which, if you had to choose one, which would be maybe Henry V, but also the other ones.
We can set aside Henry. One of the great characters that looms over this book, and there are several, and that's one of the things that makes it an interesting biography. There's the character of Henry's father, Henry Bolingbroke. A tragic life, really. The great sort of the golden knight of Europe, who'd been on crusade, who'd been as a pilgrim to the Holy Land, who was a champion jouster, who usurped the throne of England with great reluctance, and then was crippled by what he saw as God's curse for having done that. Then you mentioned John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. France was in schism because of the madness of Charles VI, and you have John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. who causes an immense amount of trouble. Addicted to causing trouble, addicted to stirring the pot, as we'd say in English. And he's an extraordinary character as well, who has this bloody and dramatic death hacked to pieces with an axe on the bridge at Montereau, which is the incident that allows Henry to make his move on the crown of France. And then there are characters like Catherine de Valois, the young daughter of the King of France, whom Henry eventually marries and who he sort of drags around these sieges, having musicians play to her every morning. So this is one of the great things about writing a biography, is that you have a sort of character at the centre, but in orbit around that character are other fantastic people who populate a book like this.
I mean, around quite literally, because the book is like told in present, so you feel as you are like there, and in a way you feel like you are Henry V. I have to say that's a great achievement.
Well, I hope so. I mean, this is the first first biography I've written. And books like the Plantagenets and the Wars of the Roses, they're kind of composite biographies. So these characters come and go. But when you're living with a single individual at the centre, certainly for a medieval historian, that's quite a difficult thing to do, because the genre of biography, as we know it in terms of modern biography, is about psychological progress, evolution, change, progression. And if we take a modern biography, it'll often be based on hundreds of thousands of documents, of letters, of things that give a deep psychological insight into that individual. Now, it's not the case for most, if not all, people of the Middle Ages, that they left these kind of documents. With Henry V, who as a 15th century king, produced a lot of documents about his life, but they're administrative documents, and they're chronicles and they're poems. In terms of his expression of how he felt and lived and how he made his decisions and how that changed over his life, it's a few dozen letters, pretty much. And most of those are to do with business. So the question for a biographer, well, one of the questions is there such a thing as medieval biography? Self-evidently, I've answered the question yes. But then it's like, how... The thing I had to decide when I was writing this book was, how do we create this sense of immediacy whilst remaining historical? And I felt that having done television and podcasts in which we normally narrate the past in the present tense, he goes there, he does that, he says this, he decides the other. This might be something interesting to try in the book itself. I was a little nervous doing it, and I didn't tell anybody I was doing this. I didn't tell any of my editors, including you. I didn't tell my agent. I didn't tell anybody that I was going to take this approach, because I thought that people would say, no, don't do it. It's kind of risky. It'll be weird. It'll be annoying. But I found that it worked. It created a sense of immediacy. I might do it again. I might not. I mean, it fitted this character very well because I think it also creates the sense of jeopardy, in that the problem with all the history books is, like, spoiler alert, we know they all die in the end, for a start, but typically we have an idea of the outline of a story before we start reading the book. So the other job as a narrative historian, a trade historian, a public historian, is how do you create tension within a story? How do you build a sense of excitement at decisions that could go either way? And so a present tense narrative approach served that as well.
Would you say like Henry V was like a lucky character? Because I mean, when he was young, he was struck by an arrow. People don't know it, but basically he always is in only on one profile, because he had when he was young been struck with an arrow in the other profile, in the other eye. So that's the reason all the profile pictures we see of him is one profile, no other kind of. So would you say he's a lucky man, or maybe he had some?
He's extraordinarily lucky. We'd call it luck. There's in Henry's world, it's divine providence. At the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, 21st of July 1403, Henry was 16 years old, and he'd been Prince of Wales, that is, heir to the English throne, for 3 years. His father had given him this apprenticeship in Wales, dealing with the rebellion of Owain Glyndŵr. He had a mentor, Henry Hotspur, heir to the Duchy of the Earldom of Northumberland. And that mentor flipped sides and rebelled against the crown. So Henry was drawn into a royal army fighting English rebels, and he was struck in the face, either on that side or on that side, we don't actually know, it's not clear, with an arrow that went into his skull to the depth of 6 inches. And so the arrowhead lodged within his skull.
Mortal, I guess, basically.
It's a miracle he wasn't killed, and literally a miracle in his view. Then there was an operation. They got the best surgeon in the country to come and remove the arrowhead, which involved opening up the wound over many days, keeping it clean, blacksmithing a special tool that would be able to grasp the arrowhead and pull it out, closing the wound, healing it, so that it may or may not have scarred. The interesting thing about seeing Henry in profile is that it's hard to match up the profile picture with the surgeon's notes, because it means that we have to answer this question of which side was the scar on. And no one ever mentioned, they never call him like Henry the Scarred Face. It may be that the surgeon was so good that he had, and he was a very good surgeon, he'd done what we'd now call plastic surgery. He'd removed eyelid bags. He may have had a potion that made the healing good enough that there wasn't a monstrous scar. And it may be that we see Henry in profile because this is a 16th century portrait copied from a coin or a medal. It's not quite clear. But what we do know is that, putting aside the matter of physical scars, this left a psychological impression. I think it left a psychological impression on Henry V. So that as he grew up, he came to act with this sense that God had spared or saved him for a purpose. And that purpose was revealed to him in this pursuit of what he would express as justice. And the purpose of justice was to take back the French lands and title that he felt he'd been cheated of as King of England. So I think there's this pivotal point in his life in July 1403, where he survives, July and August, survives this terrible injury, and from that point on lives his life in a way that's kind of directed towards clear ends with great focus and application in the service of the God that saved him.
Yeah, and he basically achieved all his ends.
Yeah, I mean, like, had he lived 6 months longer and had himself crowned king in Rome, then that would have been it. Well, having said that, there's a sense of unfinished business with Henry. His death in 1422 of dysentery while on campaign comes so suddenly. I mean, one minute he's in France fighting the Dauphin, trying to sort of conquer his way further and further south. The next minute, he's dead. And where was he at that moment? Well, the answer is that he was thinking about crusade. I think he was considering how to get himself out of this war in France, because the effort of having to, I mean, under the Treaty of Troyes, which he struck in 1420, he basically laid claim to half of France, northern France, in practical terms. To get the rest of it, he was going to have to wage this long civil war against the Dauphin, who had been disinherited. That was going to take a lot of effort and money, and it was going to be a very difficult task to convince English parliaments to keep contributing to that. So he had issues that he was contending with. He was definitely thinking about going on crusade at some point. He had people out in the Holy Lands mapping the territory, making outreach to local monarchs whose kingdoms you'd have to pass through to take an army there. So the crusade was on his mind. On his deathbed, he said, "Had I lived, I'd have rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem." Well, they all say that, but you know, he probably, if you bet on anybody to do it, it would be Henry V. So that there were always aims, and part of the psychological portrait is of a guy who's restless, who there's always a next thing, the next thing, the next thing, the next thing, the next thing.
That's his main personality feature, maybe?
I think so. I think this relentlessness and the restlessness is a really important part of understanding him. You know, there's never this sense of I've done this, so let's stop. It's like I've done this, so let's go one further and one further and one further. But that's, you know, and it's unusual that he not only had that relentlessness, but the focus, the application, the determination to see it through. He's an unusual character, but unusual characters make good subjects for biography.
Yeah. So that's the reason he was in the model for a medieval monarch.
Yes, and it's not just the conquest; it's also the foundation of the conquest, which were about justice, which was about bringing law, being a lawgiver, providing order, providing remedy, providing justice, listening to one's subjects, which could be done through parliament, but also through informal negotiation with the nobility. I mean, he mastered that side of the job as well, which is in some senses the unglamorous bit. His reputation as a lawgiver was the foundation for his achievements as a warrior, and it's the being able to do both those things that he got the credit as being the greatest of all time. And it's for that reason that when you get to the early 16th century, a young kind of teenage going on 20s, Henry VIII is like, that's the guy I want to be.
Yeah. So if you had to choose between two of the greatest English battles in the Hundred Years' War, between Crécy and Agincourt, which one would you choose?
Well, I've written about both. I mean, as you know, my book Essex Dogs was sort of drove towards the Battle of Crécy, and Henry V is always dominated by Agincourt. In many ways, they're the same battle. There's slightly different locations, but it's very similar circumstances. Both feature an English king on the war path in France, being chased, trying to get out of France, being made to stand and fight, and coming up with what amounts to a relatively simple tactic, which is goad the French into charging ranks of archers and suck them into a trap. Crécy is exciting because it's the first time. But Agincourt is fascinating because it's like this rerun where both sides know. It's not like it's an accidental repetition of history. Both sides know what happened all those years ago. 2 generations. No one fought in both battles. And they do it anyway. I mean, and particularly on the French side. I mean, in terms of sort of lasting legend, Agincourt is the one that, thanks to Shakespeare, has sort of become part of the legend of the birth of Englishness, whatever that means. But Crécy, I have a sort of great fondness for because. Partly because of writing it into fiction in Essex Dogs, where I felt like I'd really lived it, having written the story of ordinary soldiers in the thick of that battle. Whereas Agincourt, I feel, has this legend around it, but doesn't really. You can't look at Agincourt and understand Henry V. It doesn't really represent what he's all about, other than that he gets lucky, and he gets lucky a bunch of times. The main, his achievement in France was not founded on Agincourt in any sense other than that it gave him legitimacy. That actually the strategy thereafter was quite different to the one that he pursued in Agincourt. So I have a sort of fondness for Crécy with the recognition that Agincourt couldn't have happened without it.
Okay, so when you have to write about battles, I mean, medieval battles are really different from modern warfare. How did you get to translate the impression, the experience of a medieval warrior? Must be really complicated with all the armor, with all the swords.
For the most part, it's imaginative. But recently, I had the opportunity I sort of made the opportunity to try out a little bit of medieval fighting. So in 2025. A friend of mine sent me an Instagram reel of something called armoured MMA, which is cage fighting, like mixed martial arts, but it's in full medieval armour with weapons, so axes, short swords, long swords. The blades are dulled to a minimum thickness, but otherwise it's everything goes. And I flew out to Nashville, Tennessee to watch one of these shows. And then I came back and found the guy who's, the best fighter in the UK, a brilliant guy called Daniel Winter, who has a gym in the Midlands in Nottingham in the UK. I went up and just did a couple of training sessions. One out of armour, and then Daniel Winter gave me a suit of armour to try, and we had a bit of a go around. And actually, that experience of putting yourself in armour and being taught the very basics of fighting in armour by somebody who does it as the great passion of their lives was kind of useful, because even as historians, we're very influenced by television and film when it comes to combat, medieval combat, and it's hard to read into sources without overlaying what you know from TV and film, even though you know it's kind of false. So it was very interesting to strip all that away and go, okay, what's the basics? What is it like to fight in a suit of armour? What's it like to try and get up off the floor in a suit of armour? You know, you often hear it said...
Is it easy, or...?
It's not as hard as people say, but your centre of gravity is all different, because you've got a 7-kilo helmet besides the rest of the armour. And so your centre of gravity is no longer here, it's about here. So you're very top-heavy. It's not difficult. If you put a suit of armour on and were on the floor, you'd be able to get up fine.
Okay.
You might roll about a bit, but you'd be able to get up. However, if you tried to get up with somebody else in armour sitting on you, it would be a lot harder. And if you tried to get up with 2 people in armour sitting on you... Impossible, because...
How many kilos?
Like, I go about 90 kilos.
Wow.
Armour's 30. So there you go. There's 120 kilos. That's pretty heavy weight to lift up. Imagine that twice. Let's call it 250 kilos. Well, that's not far off the weight of a small car.
Wow.
Which nobody would be able to get up with that sitting on top of them. So you realise that one of the basic things you need to do in a battle is have a guy on the floor and 2 people on top of him. So it's about having asymmetry in numbers. Yeah. And that then becomes a tactic in fights between men-at-arms. It's more complicated than that in the reality of medieval battle, because, of course, you know, it's not all just a melee between men-at-arms on foot. You have horses, you have archers, you have a whole bunch of different things going on. But anyway, I found it very interesting to physically go and do this, this fighting. And I've always enjoyed putting myself in, not in harm's way, but in sort of physically experiencing things.
Like, for example?
Well, you know, I had this, as well as having a long period of my life where I've been doing history, I've also worked a lot in journalism. And when I was very young, when I was in my early 20s, I worked for magazines, and I worked for Men's Health magazine, and they used to send me off doing stunt journalism, I suppose you would call it. So jumping off a skyscraper with like a stunt wire on,
just to write
in China, just to write about the experience. Or I went, you know, going, if you've watched the Winter Olympics, there's Bob's skeleton, which is head first in the tin tray, doing that. What else? I went to Brazil and jumped off it was jumping off things. I don't really know why. I think they were trying to send me a message.
They want you in the office.
Jumping off the Iguazu Falls and swimming down the river through the jungle and all of this kind of stuff. So fighting a boxing match. So I always liked this kind of physical experimentation and then writing about the experience. So to sort of, I mean, I was a lot younger then, but to bring that into the sort of general world of history has been kind of fun. I mean, it's nothing new. You see it all the time. There's a whole branch of historical experience which is about living history. And I know you guys publish James Holland.
Yeah, of course. Inside the Shermans. Yeah.
The great man. I mean, if you ever get the chance to go to James Holland's Chalk History Festival, it is the most wonderful experience, because everywhere is living history. People living out this experience of whether it's in a World War I trench or a Roman camp or a Viking settlement, whatever it might be. That connection of the experience and the intellectual interrogation of history is super important.
Yeah. Had you, for example, tried like shooting a longbow?
Well, shooting a longbow is another way. Yeah, I'm sure I did that for...
We was like the key weapon for...
The key weapon at the Battle of Agincourt, certainly. Between the longbow in battle and the quite primitive cannon in sieges, these are the 2 weapons on which Henry V's conquest of Normandy and other bits of France were based. and again, to experience the power of the longbow, it is useful to at least have a go in shooting one. And it must have been for television or something at some point. I tried it, and you instantly realise that the strength required to fully draw a longbow doesn't come from your arms. It comes from your back, your whole body, and it can only be acquired by months or years really of training. Yeah. And then you understand why you see these laws passed by Edward III saying everybody has to train to shoot with a longbow on a Sunday afternoon or whatever it might be. That was the key to the long-term success of English armies in the Hundred Years' War, was English and Welshmen, largely, able to shoot longbows, which, if you dropped a longbow on the field in France, the average Frenchman wouldn't be able to pick it up and shoot it. Not because they're French, because they haven't spent their whole life training. Okay. It wasn't written into law. And so
every ordinary Englishman was supposed to shoot a longbow. Wow.
It's, you have this generations-long kind of production line of basic peasant archers, ordinary rank and file. You can just keep on recruiting. Now, that doesn't confer an advantage in a one-on-one fight. In a one-on-one fight between a knight and an archer, the knight wins 10 times out of 10. But in a fight where you've got a cavalry charge against ranks of longbowmen with sharpened stakes in front of them, as they had at Agincourt, then it's a much more even contest.
Wow. Well, I also want to talk about Henry V, because people don't know it, but he was had quite an intense connection with Spain, especially through his father and his grandfather. Could have he been like a Spanish monarch, not an English monarch?
Well, that's a fun counterfactual to play with. I mean, the House of Lancaster, from which Henry came, Edward III's third son, John of Gaunt, never in line to be king of England. So, through his second marriage, was pursuing a claim to the throne of Castile. Yeah. Now, at the time of Henry V's birth, that's where his grandfather, John of Gaunt, was, in Castile, trying to become king of Castile and Leon. And had he done that, there's an interesting sort of counterfactual where maybe his son, Bolingbroke, became king of Castile and not of England. And then his son, Henry V, became king of Castile. So then you'd have had no Agincourt and
everything changes.
None of that. Everything changes. But I mean, that's one of the fun things to do in history, is to play these sliding doors moments where things went differently to the way they did.
Yeah, I mean, and also which was the role of the Spanish kingdoms in the whole 100 Years' War? Because, for example, Castile was allied to France, Aragon was mainly allied to England. So how was that relationship?
Well, yeah, as we've discussed, I mean, as the 100 Years' War developed, they started to draw in the neighbouring realms. In Henry V's reign, it was a fairly contained battle between four main protagonists: England and Burgundy, Scotland and France. A bit more complicated, but that's what it amounts to. It's a northern campaign. But if you look at Edward III's reign before, there's been an extremely heavy Castilian involvement because of the need because of Castilian naval power. Okay. And whoever was allied with Castile tended to have an advantage in the Channel.
In the English Channel?
In the English Channel.
So the Castilian Navy was a key factor in the English Channel?
The Castilian Navy was a very important factor in the English Channel, and it's a bit like, if you think about the Straits of Hormuz today, these sea channels are very important. The Straits of Dover, between Dover and Calais, were an extremely sensitive pinch point in Western European trade, because people coming from Flanders to southern Europe had to sail through there. Yeah. There's no other way to go. Well, there was, but you have to go around the north of Scotland. No one's going to do that. So control of that little strait became extremely important, which is why it mattered so much. Two things mattered. Firstly, English control of Dover and Calais gave them control of the strait, but set against that was an alliance with Castile, and the French were allied with Castile, and then they had the naval power. So these are the sort of economics underpinned a lot of the strategy in war.
Yeah. So between the French, the English, and the Castilians, which one would you say had the superior navy? all in all?
Castilians.
Yeah.
At this point, I mean, later on,
Yeah.
much later on in history, the English start to develop, as we know, a world-class, world-conquering navy. Yeah. But it's Castilian naval power that's at stake right from Edward III's reign. I mean, actually all the way up till after the 100 Years' War, even in the Wars of the Roses, there's still this sense that the Castilian ships in the Channel are a really important military and political factor in decision making.
Yeah, and for example, when you've written your historical fiction, like the Essex-Dawes trilogy, you, for example, cover like battles in the battlefield, but you also cover like battles in the sea. How were they different, like that? The strategies, the feelings, yeah.
Well, to some extent, battles at sea in the Middle Ages were just land battles on ships.
Okay.
It's still you still see archers, knights, hand-to-hand fighting. We're not yet in the age of ships with cannon mounted on the side.
So you have to get close, I guess.
So you have to get close, ram the other ship, or somehow grapple it so that you can literally jump from one ship to the next and have and fight and try and sink the ship. I mean, the third Essex-Dawes novel that I wrote was about the Battle of Winchelsea, and that's a battle which is decided by kind of kamikaze tactics almost on the English behalf, where after they're all drunk, and King Edward III gives the decision that they're just going to ram all the Castilian ships instead of trying to board them. They're going to sail as fast as they can into the side of them and see who sinks. A high-risk strategy, which paid off in that instance for the English. But yeah, sea battles in this age were largely land battles on ships. Yeah.
So getting back to Henry V, we say that being called the sixth is like a dumb number, because, for example, Charles VI, he was crazy. Ferdinand VI of Spain was also crazy. And then you have like the son of Henry V, Henry VI, which was crazy too.
Well, maybe we should just skip the number and you go straight from 5th to 7th. Well, Henry V's son, Henry VI, was couldn't have been more different to his father, and suffered periodically throughout his life with bouts of insanity, catatonia. He would just refuse to acknowledge anybody, eat anything, move for months. It's sometimes said that this may have been hereditary through his grandfather, Charles VI, because Henry V married a French princess, and daughter of the Mad King, Charles VI. Although there's symptoms presented in different ways, and there's no way of proving now whether it was hereditary or just coincidence. But the pressure of being Henry VI was immense. And his upbringing as a king was radically different from Henry V. I mean, Henry V, as I've said, had this long apprenticeship. He was Prince of Wales from the age of 13 when his father snatched the English crown, and became king at 26. So a 13-year, really tough apprenticeship. He had to fight in battles. He was injured badly in battles. He took control of the royal council when his father was unwell, and so had this hands-on business in helping run the kingdom.
And then you have like Charles VI, who was crowned when he was like 1 year old.
Henry VI, when he's young, yes. I mean, he becomes king when he's less than 1 year old, and so
both of France and England.
Of England, he becomes English king when he's in effect he becomes French king, laying claim to that French throne is very difficult because the Dauphin Charles VII, future Charles VII, is also a claimant, but it's just a very difficult upbringing for Henry VI, but I think you see this as a pattern, certainly across English kingship, is that the kings who have an apprenticeship tend to do better. So Edward I is a good example. The kings who have this thrust upon them when they're children, it's very difficult for them politically and psychologically to grow into the role of being a capable king. And Henry VI, I mean, you have someone like Richard II, who's told he's the sort of saviour when he's a little child, and it becomes a sort of megalomaniac tyrant. With Henry VI, the pressure is just too much, and you see him retreating and trying to escape from it until finally he collapses into a form of insanity, which is the ultimate escape, and that he won't recognise the world at all. Yeah. Just a very strange position for any person to be in, I suppose.
Yeah. So Charles VI's insanity is what explains the War of the Roses. Of course, you've written the War of the Roses, that book that we published here in Attico. Is Charles VI's insanity the reason to explain that conflict?
Well, Henry VI, yeah. So his inability as king, Henry VI's inability as king, goes beyond insanity. Mm-hmm. One of the manifestations of his retreat from the world is not a refusal to make any decision, but a refusal to play an active part in kingship, to step forward and grip the rule of the realm. And his long, slow failure as a monarch mm-hmm. leads to this kind of creeping collapse of the English polity, which is based. It's like an inverted pyramid, balancing on its tip. Without the king, things cease to function. And what you see in Henry VI's reign, leading through to the Wars of the Roses, is a period where people try to keep the realm going without a king. Mm-hmm. And that's somewhat easier when the king is a child, because you sort of set up a regency and have a fiction that the king is there, but the expectation he'll be along as soon as he's grown up. And then you have a more difficult phase where the king is an adult but is incapable of ruling. Mm-hmm. And it becomes more and more difficult to sustain this system, which is heavily reliant on having an effective, what we now call chief executive. Yeah. And eventually everything starts to just rot and collapse until you have Richard, Duke of York, claims the throne for himself. And this can only be sorted out through battle. I mean, in Shakespeare's hands, to return briefly to Shakespeare, he turns this into a sort of a crime and punishment story. He says that actually the original sin comes in 1399 with the deposition of Richard II. That sort of tears this hole in the fabric of the moral universe, and that can only be repaired with this generational payment of a blood debt, in a sense. That there has to be this bloodletting to punish England for killing a king. And then eventually you kill Richard III, the sum of all evil, and order's restored through the Tudors. Well, that's the Shakespearean shape. It's not necessarily the true historical shape, but the fact is you have in the 15th century an extremely turbulent and difficult century, particularly from the reign of Henry VI onwards. And so it's no surprise that when you get to someone like Henry VIII, looking back, he's like, well, when was the last time we had a really great king? Henry V at the beginning of the century. And so it's this people always tend to look to the past for a model for the future. And from the perspective of the 16th century, Henry V was, well, that's what we want to get back to. That's when we were great. Make England great again,
Yeah. And of course, you have Henry V, which is a king that achieves a lot of stuff, and one of the key achievements of him is like gaining the throne of France for his descendants. Do you think that a personal union of like France and England could be sustainable in the long term?
A union of England with continental realms typically doesn't last a very long time, and Brexit is one example among many of that. I think that there was a Brexit fear in the 15th century under Henry V, that the people who were probably most nervous about Henry having two crowns, England and France, were the English, not the French. I mean, the French...
But they were trying to conquer, like, the French throne.
Yeah, well, that's the question is...
They were funding it.
They were funding the war, but once it got to a certain point, they were like, well, we're done now. Okay. And in 1420, Henry had got back Normandy, which had once, since 1066, there'd been this belief that was part of England, or connected to England, it should be. He'd claimed the French crown, but then the English parliaments were like, well, how long are we expected to pay for this? And where's our money going to be going now? It's not going into a conquest for England. We'll be paying for your war as King of France. We don't want to put money into the EU budget, as it were. It's this mentality, which is like, it's very island and insular. It's like, we don't want to have anything to do with a war in the south of France. I don't care about that. And so Henry had created quite a difficult situation, which is like, he might have been able, with his extraordinary personal talent, to carry out this pair of roles, be King of England and be King of France. But not many other people would. And the sort of the medium-term question was like, what happens after you? Like, how is this going to work? And the English have this deep inferiority complex towards the French, masked as a sort of as hatred. And they felt, I think, in 1420, if we end up in a personal union, with a personal union of the two crowns, we, the English, are always going to be the junior partner. And we don't want that. Okay. We don't want to be this sort of second fiddle. So it was, but then Henry died in 1422 and never had to deal with the full consequences of that. It was an intriguing problem that was never quite seen through.
Yeah. So Henry dies, and he was like a deeply religious person. We've talked about it, and there's like some fun cameo in your book, for example, the Holy Foreskin. So let's talk about that episode, because when I read it, I was really laughing about it.
Yeah, I always like relics, and I always like weird stuff, and it's good to include these in the book. There was a relic in the Middle Ages. Well, in fact, there were quite a lot of them. Which was the foreskin of Christ, the Holy Prepuce, which was said to be the only physical bit of Christ that had been left on earth after the ascent to heaven. This had been removed in the Feast of the Circumcision. So it was a treasured relic that was considered to be very helpful to women in childbirth. And when Catherine de Valois was pregnant and going to give birth to Henry VI at Windsor in December 1421, the Holy Foreskin was sent over to England to ensure that she had a safe delivery, which it did. Like any old relic, there were lots of them flying about. I mean, there's like whose head was it? They had two of them in Damascus. So there was the head of St. James or something like that. There were plenty of them all over the place, and in Damascus there were actually two. So they can't all be the real ones. But the whole subject of relics is interesting anyway, because from the 21st century point of view, it's easy to dismiss these things and say, well, the Holy Foreskin, it was probably just, a bit of old, pork rind or whatever. The truth is somewhat more complex than that. And medieval people were not stupid. They had a different set of religious and mystic beliefs than we do, but they certainly weren't stupid. And Boccaccio writes about this. The item itself was not the important thing. It was the belief that it that was channeled through the item and up to God, whatever it may be. But I think when I'm writing any of these books, I'm always on the lookout for these sort of colourful details and features and stories and anecdotes, because I think it really brings the hard political stories alive. Yeah.
So you are into so many things. You are into documentaries, into podcasts. This is History Podcast. You are into non-fiction, into fiction. Which one do you prefer?
My favourite is always the thing that I'm going to do next.
Okay. What's next?
I like all of it. I think they're all connected via a certain sensibility towards storytelling. It's become a great cliche in modern times to say, I'm a storyteller. People selling bags of crisps say, I'm a storyteller. We're all storytellers. But a certain approach towards telling historical stories is what I like to take. And there are different forms of doing that. You can do it one way through documentary, another way through non-fiction, another way through fiction, another way in audio, another way in we're working on movies, and exploring the different ways to bring history to life for ordinary people. That's what connects everything I do, and that's what I've always enjoyed and still enjoy mercifully.
So we're getting close to the end of the interview, where we're running out of time. But the last question: if you only had to give one reason to the reader to go and read this book, which would it be?
Well, this is the reason that everybody liked Henry in his time was that he was said to be the greatest man that ever ruled England. And if you want to understand what English kingship was, this life will tell you. And it's also the life of somebody who's absolutely weird and bizarre.
We haven't talked a lot about him, but he's really weird.
And that's what makes an interesting biography. This is a bizarre man who, through that bizarre force of personality, became the greatest medieval king that England ever had.
And he could that be out of one piece? Because your first chapter is the boy of the straw hat, like Luffy the straw hat. Yeah. So, well, that for the One Piece fans, there you have it.
There you go.
Yeah, so it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Ok, pues ha sido un auténtico placer hoy estar con este auténtico titán de la historia, Dan Jones, hablando sobre todo de Enrique V, pero no solo Enrique V, como habéis comprobado. Muchas gracias. Nos vemos en la siguiente charla del Ático.